Hello, this is Mark Lieberman, the host of the radio show The World According to Mark, brought to you through WPVM FM in Asheville, North Carolina, and streaming on WPVMFM.org. My guest today is Robert, parentheses, Bob Kaplan. I will refer to him as Bob. Bob, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you for having me.
And Bob is somewhat of an unusual pick for my show. We're not going to be talking about politics or the environment or Trump, probably not, but we are going to talk.
We could bring it up.
We could bring it up. But Bob, who has many talents, but what he's been doing for 44, 47 years is he has been producing animation and other kinds of art projects, but not for exhibition at the Louvre. He does it for exhibition and cross-examination and exposition in courtrooms. So he is hired out, or he hires himself out by to lawyers who are litigators and trying to prove a point, and he does it with his skill with computer generated video and the like, and a bunch of other stuff. So again, thanks for being on the show, Bob. Why don't you introduce yourself a bit better than I just did? Talk about how you got in.
You covered it all. We're done.
Okay, we're done. All right. So you've been doing it for a long time.
Since 1978. So we're what, 44 years?
Yes.
It's primarily demonstrative evidence specialists, meaning I'll provide exhibits either in graphic arts, posters, photography, scale models, full-size models, computer animations.
Okay.
Primarily for litigation purposes, to demonstrate how accidents happened, how machines work, what the scientific principles may be. It's visual representations of what you're going to hear testimony about.
Okay, so most people go ahead.
Helping the attorneys take very complex issues and simplifying them so the jury is able to understand more.
Okay.
Just another means of communicating.
So for those of you who did not even know that there was such a thing, or a person or a company that did these things, we'll talk about that a little bit more. But another way of talking about what you do is you make attorneys who are normally boring, blasé, hyper-technical, and go in the weeds, that you help them make their presentation for persuasive purposes and possibly for entertainment a little bit more interesting. So when I was practicing law and when I was litigating, and from what I've seen on courtroom proceedings that are on television, you see witnesses who are put on the stand, raise their right hand, put it on the Bible or the Quran if they permit that, and testify, and then get cross-examined. Occasionally or frequently, you'll also see somebody with a flipboard, and then you'll see a grainy video sometimes to illustrate and provide evidence. Pretend you don't hear that noise in the background. So in any event, but you have done this work for a long enough time before people were using computers to do this. So you were providing other sorts of ways of depicting, as you say, complex issues. So talk about how this field has transformed itself through the years and how you've been heavily involved in transforming it with what you do.
Well, as I said, I started 44 years ago, and things were considerably different in the sense of the technologies involved. When I started, we were still using 8mm and 16mm motion pictures that we would have to document with. The only video at the time was black and white. We had, a huge camera and a recording device that you had to lug around, and they were only black and white cameras. Um, Most of the work that we provided, the work product, was based on the fact that we would have to go out and document the scenes of the accident or incident um, photographically. Um, Most of the information we got was written down on a notebook. We would have to use tape measures, measure the distance. If, for instance, I was doing a railroad car, we'd have to measure it left and right and up and down and have what was called field reports. Today, you can point your camera at something and it'll automatically tell you with either lasers systems that are available. They'll measure, they'll document every square inch of it in thousands and thousands of points. So the technology is truly advanced. What has not advanced is the idea of providing clear and concise information to the jury. Most of the information that we take in is visual and audible. When an attorney has to demonstrate or inform the jury on how this particular accident happened or how this particular process takes place, they can talk for 45 minutes and maybe 3 or 4 of the jurors will understand. If you have a visual aid, you can give them more information in a much faster and more effective means by showing them versus just telling them. So it's a marvelous aid to inform and get your point across.
Okay, so attorneys, as I said, have been inclined in the past, and maybe some still do today, to use a depiction, well, using like a flip chart. So they'll stand up there with a big flip chart. They'll have a Sharpie in their hands. I'm not mentioning Trump. I said we wouldn't. So the famous Sharpie gate. But in any event, they'll draw something, or it'll be already set up where it has already been pre-drawn, or they'll have a photograph. And as you say, the information that the lawyer arguing his or her case wants to convey can be better explained through visual. But and more, a picture is worth 1,000 words or something along those lines. So that's the concept. But I want to back up, and I want you to give some examples. But let's back up for a second. And again, for those who don't watch a lot of courtroom drama, or the only courtroom stuff they saw was Perry Mason 100 years ago, to get evidence, to be able to provide, and this is evidence, what of a sort. It's not the gun. It's not, it's not a signed document. It is evidence of a sort. But because you're not actually, because you're constructing it, so to speak, based upon whatever reviews you've done and analysis and measuring and all the rest of that, you can't just bring it in. The lawyer has to do what they call set a foundation, which I'm sure you know as well, if not better than I do. Why is this evidence being introduced? How do you, quote, authenticate it, make sure it's reasonable, because you don't want to introduce things, and the judge won't let you introduce, and the opposing counsel won't let you introduce things for which you haven't laid a foundation. So I'm imagining, Bob, that early on, that it was more complicated, challenging to get the court, much less the opposing counsel, to not, to allow this evidence to be put in front of the jury. And I'm guessing that over time, up to the present, it's become more acceptable in the same way that, you couldn't get tape recorded stuff in easily, but now you can. But there's all kinds of concerns that judges and lawyers will have about whether what is being provided, while interesting, is accurate enough so it's not going to prejudice the jury in a biased way to reach a determination when the foundation hasn't been set. So I've talked a lot. Let me let you explain it more colorfully than me, because I'm talking like a lawyer for a minute.
Well, in the early days, I'll give you an example. When video recording suddenly became much easier and more affordable, um, we had 8 millimeter and 16 millimeter motion picture work. In the early days, when you would bring in a video, you had to have a big television, no flat panels back then. They were, big, huge monitors we'd have. And there were a number of judges that weren't familiar with video. And there was the impression that, well, video was much easier to make changes to and edit and do special effects and things like that. So there was always in the beginning, no, we're not sure if that's going to be good because it's too easy to change. You can do much more things electronically than you could when you had to cut and paste all the film together. That eventually, people got used to it and seeing video more and more and more. When it came about to computer animations in the courtroom, that was a completely different situation. People were used to seeing CG when you go to the movies, Star Wars, and just a plethora. And now CG is so everyday. Um, the downside is,
Ubiquitous. It's
yeah,
ubiquitous.
downside is that you could do so much more editing and so much more faking things with computer animation or CG that you ever could before. So there was that discussion that was going on. In most cases today, an animation is accepted just as well as a photograph, provided, providing you meet the criteria that it has to, conform to the rules of evidence for that particular state, because each state has, different criteria. Um, it has to get through the discovery process. Um, your presentation has to be given prior to trial to the opposing attorneys. It has to be shown to the judge before a jury ever sees it. So there's a lot of hurdles that you have to pass in order to get it introduced into evidence. There are certain situations that have come up over the years where I was asked to produce a piece of demonstrative evidence, and there was no objection because it could be used for the defense just as well as it could have been used for the plaintiff. I've had situations where both sides of a case hired me to do the work because they both found it advantageous. It's good for me, and there are things about it that can be good for you.
Interesting. My guest is Bob Kaplan, and his company is 11th Hour Animation. And we're talking about what he does to assist attorneys, jurors, the judge, everybody to understand what would otherwise be a much more complicated case that depends upon, evidence of what happened at a particular point in time that's relevant to the litigation. So while I mention it, why don't you tell people how they can take a look at what you do and what your website information is, Bob?
Okay, I've got an old website.
Or they can just look you up on Facebook.
Look me up on Facebook too. It's 11th Hour Animation, ELEVENTH, spell it out, 11thhouranimation.com.
Okay. And off air, you told me when we were preparing for the show that 11th Hour name had something behind it. Not to steal your thunder, most people, when they hear 11th hour, as you said, they think what?
Last minute.
Right.
And I've had, attorneys or consulting firms call me up and say, hey, we want to do this and that and everything. And I said, okay, it's a great project. When do you need it? And they would say Thursday, and today is Tuesday. And I would say, no, it's 11th hour, not last minute.
I
Um,
see.
but that's part of litigation. Things come up, things change all the time. You have to be ready to make changes on a fly to a certain degree. I mean, if you're building a very large exhibit, for instance, we spoke about the fact that at one point years ago, I had to do a railroad car, the rear end of a railroad hopper car. How do you get that into a courtroom? Well, you have to build modular sections. You have to plan that out. They each have to be built individually. You have to set it up somewhere first. And it's got to fit into, in most cases, an elevator. Now, when I was doing that in Chicago, the elevator was, a 4 by 6 foot elevator. Try to get a 15-foot high, exhibit into it. So there's a lot of planning involved in stuff like that. Plus the fact that you don't have a lot of time to set these full scale exhibits and mock-ups in the courtroom. The judge isn't going to give you, 4 hours to put it up. If you can't do it in 30 minutes or less, forget it.
And generally speaking, you can't get the railroad car into the courtroom.
Uh, uh, most courtrooms, right, do not have a.
So let me go off on a slight tangent that you reminded me of in your earlier remarks. One of the things that you hear a lot about these days on social media, like you can hear everything on social media, is false depictions of individuals, taking the head or the body, or taking the head of whoever it is you want to poke fun at, vilify, embarrass, whatever, and putting that on another body, or doing a complete mock-up. Now, obviously, there's not much, I don't see much application in what you do in terms of 11th hour animation in the courtroom setting, but I think it's at least relevant. And I wonder if it actually comes up where somebody questions your depiction. And it might not be a human being, but it might be, again, where a human being was. Let's just say, as an example, and you can choose any example you want, Bob, that you're showing a 2 or 3 car accident, and you're trying to show what happened when a car, went through the light and then hit somebody and then hit somebody else, and so on and so forth. And obviously, most of the time, there are not videos that actually took the occurrence itself, but you have worked on things like that, I'm sure.
Yes. You have to understand there's basically two types of evidence that you're going to be dealing with. Demonstrative evidence and substantive evidence. And here's the basic difference. What I do is demonstrative evidence. The exhibits, animations, photographs, whatever, is all going to be introduced into evidence to be used with an expert's testimony, a witness testimony, or something like that. It's an extension, a visual representation of what the testimonies are going to be about, okay? If there are no witnesses, an accident happened, and we're not sure how exactly it happened, now you're getting into the area of computer modeling. Computers today, the simulations that can be done with a computer are incredible. The product that the computer is going to do, okay, the evidence that it's, I want to get this right now, the computer is giving the answers, okay? We have no witness testimony to it. So the computer is giving the response. You're basing the information on what the computer model is telling you. Whereas witness testimony and demonstrative evidence doesn't use the simulation process, if that makes any sense, if I'm explaining it correctly.
Go ahead. Well, let me interpose a question, for example, unless you're still.
No, no, go ahead.
Well, here's again sort of a question that I don't quite understand. I said in the introduction to this line of discussion, oftentimes there's not a video of the incident, and if we're talking about an automobile accident, that's pretty typical. But you have to have information put into your hands that you can then use to construct the so-called simulation or the animation. I'll just say animation for ease of discussion. And typically, I'm guessing what you have in, again, auto accident is there's a collision, 2 vehicles, 3 vehicles, whatever. So you have sources of information. You have, if the driver of vehicle 1 hopefully is not dead, the driver of vehicle 2 is not dead. Perhaps they called, presumably they called the police. The police show up not when the accident's happening, but afterwards, and they look at things like, tire skids and what happens on the pavement and where the glass is and the position of the vehicles when they came to rest after the accident. So what do you do with all that?
Okay, we know the type of vehicles, for instance, it's a Chevy and a Ford. Those are modeled. Okay, we build those vehicles. We know the width of the road. We know the dimensions of the if it's a T-bone accident, for instance. Okay, we go out to the site. We have police reports. We have all kinds of documentation that we have. Most of the time, you're going to have an accident reconstructionist that may be working, and what he does is he will give me that data, okay, whether it's the police reports, all the other measurements. I'll get the speeds of the vehicles and all that stuff. That can be put into the computer. I have many, many, many different types of animation programs to choose from to use this, and then we put it together that way. It's not like the attorney says to me, okay, I want a car going left and a car going right, and I want them to hit. You're never going to get something like that introduced to evidence. It has to be based on the police reports, on sometimes there's black boxes on the cars today that have, all kinds of information, the speed of the vehicle, what the G-forces were, if they were wearing seatbelts or not. So there's a plethora of information available, and what I do is then put that together as the visual representation of what the accident reconstructionist is going to be talking about. So all this is a guide to help the jury or whatever it may be, to help them understand what's going on.
Okay, so earlier you mentioned that sometimes there's so much confidence in the art and science of what you do that attorneys on both sides, plaintiff and defendant, will both seek your assistance, and presumably you'll make one video or one simulation. But that strikes me as a little odd. So I mean, I know you're telling me what happens, but here's the thought that I have. Again, returning to the paradigm example of like 2 vehicles colliding. Okay, so let's say that it becomes a piece of evidence as to whether one of the cars had turned on their right turn signal to make a right turn, or let's say that part of the issue was, did vehicle 1 come to a complete stop before proceeding through the intersection? And those are elements that are important because they will determine the extent to which one or the other party was negligent, or a party proceeded appropriately, but the other party did not. And you're not going to get the same point of view, obviously. If you're the plaintiff, and the plaintiff's attorney is going to say, my client did everything right, came to a complete stop, put on a signal, and then turned, but notwithstanding that, the defendant, via driving vehicle two, completely ignored it and was driving an excessive rate of speed, and that's why the accident occurred. How do you deal with that? How does that work?
In a situation like that, I won't. And let me explain that. It's real simple. Um, a lot of attorneys would say to me what they want.
Right.
It's my responsibility to tell them what they need. Okay? And there are situations where it doesn't make sense to put an animation together because there's too many variables, especially in an automobile accident. Um, I've done so much other work outside of the auto crash field that's going on right now. There's all kinds of specialists and stuff for automobile reconstruction accidents. Um, I've worked on other situations where, say, somebody had their hand um, hurt on a piece of machinery. Well, in a situation like that, there aren't that many variables. Was there a guard on there, or was there not a guard to prevent you from putting your hand into something like that? And if there wasn't a guard, we can explain why, why it wasn't on there to begin with. So auto accidents are like real iffy. Um, because there are so many variables involved. There are some clear-cut cases where, yeah, this is real easy to do. We have all the information, you know, we have all kinds of video. We may even have surveillance video of the accident, but it's so far away you can't see any details. So then we can, take that and give you a better view of it, or clearer view with the information we have. There's tons of things. But the amount of vehicle accidents that I've done is tiny compared to other things. Elevators falling, cranes tipping over, people putting their hands in machines where they had no business being,
Bridges collapsing.
bridges collapsing, of course, buildings being hit by airplanes.
Okay.
There's also tons of train accidents. In 44 years, I've seen the worst possible accidents that people can get into.
Okay.
It's amazing how ridiculous some things and how they happen. And then on the other hand, there's some tragic accidents that could have easily have been avoided. And these are the things that you have to show the jury.
Okay. So we're talking to Bob Kaplan, who is the principal in 11th Hour Animation. And we're talking about, again, what he does and how it works in a litigated context. Sometimes most cases are settled out of court, and there's an exchange of information which helps attorneys make their minds up as to how they deal with that. And then sometimes when the case goes to trial, that information is still needing to get submitted into evidence. So I'm curious, Bob, again, you always, if your work comes into play and it's going to be introduced into evidence, how much of the time, either in the past or these days, are you called upon to prove your expertise? I mean, you're not going to be questioned on anything substantive like, do you think that the car was going too fast? I keep going back to the car. Do you do you think that the bridge was constructed appropriately? They're not asking you that because you're not a bridge specialist. But if they're gonna show evidence of a bridge collapsing, or some part of the bridge, or a machine that either malfunctions or resulted in an industrial accident, uh, do they have to get you up there to describe how you put together the animation or the evidence?
In years ago, when we first started doing animations and exhibits, bringing them into court, yeah, I had to qualify just about everything I did. For two reasons. One, it has to be accurate. If I'm building a physical exhibit, for instance, I'm making a scale model of a bridge. okay? It has to be scaled properly. So if everything has to be accurate, all the particular components of the machine, for instance, does not have to be there. I'll give you an example. If it's a punch press, giant punch press, every nut and bolt does not have to be there. That's not part of the accident. The components, the actual area in which an accident may have happened on a particular piece of machine, yes, it has to be absolutely accurate in its detail. It can't be off by a 16th of an inch. If it's 3.5 inches, it has to be, the model has to have 3.5 inches. Those have to be accurate. In animation, the uh, uh, if the space on the road is a 12-foot wide lane, I have to prove that I built it to scale. As far as testifying now, I haven't testified in court in quite some time. There's, I guess there's almost a point at which people know it's accurate. You know, they assume at this point that, you know, what you're doing is correct. I haven't had any problems because most of the time, for instance, there may be a mechanical engineer, okay, involved in this particular case. He is the one that's going to be testifying about the accuracy of the exhibit. So now my work is more or less deferred for him to get it introduced into evidence.
Then he can pick it apart if he wants to.
He can pick it apart. The attorneys can pick it apart. Either side could fight over it. Um, it's almost like I am not there as an expert witness on how the machine works. I was simply the facilitator to build the exhibit or to put the animation together for them to use.
Okay. And as you mentioned earlier, whatever it is that is going to be produced by you for the benefit of the trial, it has to be viewed by or shown in advance by the attorney seeking to introduce it to the opposing counsel and also to the judge. And if they think the opposing counsel, who's a potentially opposing, opposing counsel, if they say, no, this is not right, this is not the way it was, or whatever, then that information gets filtered back to you by the attorney who hired you, and you have to consider whether a modification is appropriate. Does that happen?
Yes, I've had a number of times where I'll give you an example. I had a case that's I've been working on for 5 years since they initially filed until it finally, you know, wound up going to it didn't go to the jury. They wound up settling the case. But over that period of time, more information came out, so changes had to be made. At one point, they said there was one person, and now there's suddenly two people. So you have to go back and you do that and correct it. Now, if the opposing attorneys who did not hire me, if they have a problem with it, it can either go to the judge and the judge decides whether we can use it, or they're more than welcome to hire another person to do their own animation. You know, if we say there were two people on it and you say there was one person on it, well, okay, we'll have dueling animations or dueling exhibits.
Okay. So sort of a joke here, but you weren't called upon to do an animation or simulation of the January insurrection in Washington, right?
I don't think my computer could handle the crowds and generate it as quickly as it did on the 6th. It would
Okay,
take me much longer to plan that one out.
I understand. Well,
Nobody could afford it.
of course. Okay. So, so is there do you get involved in both typically civil and criminal cases? Does the DA or the AG? So
Yes.
I know you don't want to name names or point to specific cases that on this broadcast, but can you tell us about a juicy case, so to speak, or an interesting case that would help illustrate what you did?
I did work on a murder case, and it was a question about whether, how to phrase this.
The butler did it.
Yeah, well, no, a lot of it was on video. There were surveillance videos. And one of the contentions was how close was somebody to the incident that happened. And what I had to do was triangulate where they were located by using 3 different cameras, and they wanted a view from the top down, looking down. So there was a lot of math and geometry involved with that as to where each individual in the scene was located. Um, so I did that one. Boy, I've done stuff for TV commercials too. I've done, oh boy, over, 44 years is a long time to think of all the stuff that's gone through the office. Um,
Well, let me
it's,
ask you.
it,
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I've taken a really good hobby and ruined it by making it a profession. It, I built models as a kid, and I was the geek in the basement with a computer making a dot go from one side of the screen to the other, thinking that was really cool. So all these things, and of course, photography was a great hobby, and I ruined that by being a commercial photographer before I got into this. So, and building models as a kid and being into computers, I basically, I haven't worked a day in my life because they've all been hobbies. So in that
Well,
regard, I've been lucky.
well, that brings up an interesting question for me, and hopefully the audience will want to hear it too. How did you find out, since you were mostly sort of a hobbyist in all these endeavors, how did you figure out that there was a thing here, a thing that could be, to use the term, monetized or commoditized or whatever, that you could make money at because people, the legal profession needed it? How'd you figure that out?
I didn't. And the interesting thing was my wife did.
Okay.
We had just gotten married, and I decided I didn't want to be a commercial photographer anymore. So I didn't have a job. We had a great honeymoon. We came back and figured out, okay, Bob, what are you going to do? And she was looking through an ad in the local newspaper, and it said, wanted photographer model maker. And I thought, wow, I'll check it out. And I went to this consulting firm, and it was a very small firm when I joined. And when I left 19 years later, um, there were like over 100 people in it. I mean, it was a wonderful job because I worked out of the CEO's house, and his wife would make us breakfast in the morning, and it was wonderful. But I started building exhibits and test fixtures and doing all the photography and the cinematography for a consulting engineering firm. And learned a lot doing that. I had a very good teacher.
So,
And so
go ahead.
it wasn't something that I started out looking for.
Okay. Well, put modesty aside. So would that suggest to you that you were one of the first of your kind in this process?
I think so. I think so.
Okay.
There are many engineering firms today that have the capabilities to do what I do. Um, there's huge firms out there that do it. I can't compete with that, but then again, I'm cheaper.
Okay. I was going to ask you, what is it that these days with, other competitors, presumably more well-heeled competitors, You didn't show me your balance sheet or your income statement, but how do you compete with them because they have so much more resources behind them?
I have a lot of repeat uh, clients. Um, I said, you know, I've been doing it for a while, long before I had gray hair.
Mhm.
So there are a
I
lot
thought
of
that was simulated gray hair. I didn't
no,
know,
no,
know
no, no, no.
that. It's real. Okay.
It's real. It's real. I won't show you the back, but the sides are real. No, I've been at it a while. Since I would say 2008, things have really changed as far as litigation goes. Um, 2008 was a real gut punch to the legal firms. A lot of them went out of business. A lot of attorneys, a lot of shops closed up, and a lot fewer litigations actually going to trial.
Right.
A lot of work these days is all for settlement conferences.
I'd like to talk
That's a
about
whole
that.
other area.
Well, I'd like to talk about that, but let's bring it up to further. So 2008, most people associate that date with the collapse of the financial markets and the real
Right.
estate, so on and so forth. And obviously, if people are not buying and selling real estate, then a lot of lawyers who do that kind of work
Mhm.
have to switch to chasing ambulances, and maybe some of them can't run that fast. So, but during COVID, of course, the point that comes up to me is a lot of courtrooms were closed in the sense that many of them were not actually having trials, much less allowing trials to proceed in person. But and playing presumably into what you're good at, a lot of that proceeded anyhow, but it proceeded virtually, much like we're having
Yeah.
this conversation now. So how has the pandemic affected your business?
Um, it really hasn't because a lot of stuff that I do anyway, as long as the animations are concerned, everything is going over the web anyway. I'm sending them the stuff on the web to their, you know, drop boxes and stuff. So anything I do can be done that way. Depositions over Zoom like we're doing now. In those cases, I've had a couple that have gone just fine.
So that's good. So
Yeah, yeah,
let
like
me
photographs and stuff like that. It's just the building the you know miniatures of bridges and stuff like that. Yeah, that I can't do.
so returning again to something you talked about earlier, which is I want to distinguish the model making from the computer generated animation or simulation. Most people, um, all younger, understand computer graphics certainly better than I do. I'm guessing um, that with computer generated video, that somehow you have these elaborate software programs, and if you want to get something that looks like a train that was involved in a particular accident or a bridge that collapsed, you just move. I'm simplifying this. You move your cursor and you click on it, and then,
Oh,
but it doesn't work. So can you?
oh, if you were correct.
So how? So without going completely in the weeds, how does this actually work? You've said again before we went on air that you will go out to the site of where something happened that is involved in a particular piece of litigation. So you actually go there, and even though the accident or incident is not in progress, you take a picture, you take a video, but then
Yeah.
there's nothing in that video that demonstrates what actually happened that's the
Okay.
subject of
Well,
the
a
litigation.
lot of times you're gonna be using a similar object if it's say a skylift or a crane or something like that that may have been involved. You'll go out to the site and you'll do an inspection and you'll look at that piece of equipment, which is an identical piece, and you can do all your measurements off of that one. Sometimes we get lucky and we can actually, you know, go out and see the exact one that was involved in the accident. If it's not damaged, we'll still, you know, measure and stuff like that. A lot of the documentation we can get from the manufacturer. They have all the blueprints and the plans, so I can get a lot of stuff like that. One of the advantages of a physical model or an exhibit, um, you can actually walk around it. You can actually demonstrate things in the courtroom with it. Um, there were times where I had people that it was, say, the rear end of a truck and somebody may have fallen off, and how did that happen? We set that up and you can actually climb up on it and do the physical acts, or
What do you
they
mean?
want to.
What do you mean you? So let's say let's say that you have that truck. Does somebody? I don't. I'm guessing
The
not the
attorney.
lawyer, not the, the
Yeah, there have been attorneys that have done it, absolutely.
hmm,
Absolutely. You know, I'll go in, I'll set it up. If they want to use me, yeah, okay, I can do that. You know, that's as far as my acting capabilities go. Could I climb a truck? Yes.
okay.
But there's advantages. Sometimes they'll have the exhibit because it may be sitting in the courtroom, and people tend to look over at it and check it out. Whereas in animation, may not be. You'll see it once and you'll have to remember, you know, what happened. Sometimes they leave photographs in the courtroom and they can always refer back and forth to that.
Or they'll leave the
It
video. I
depends.
guess they could leave the video in the courtroom. I guess
You can't leave the video running.
can't do that. Okay. Okay.
Can't do that. I've never seen it done.
So I guess in a particular case, what you're saying is sometimes the computer graphics animation is the best depiction of what the attorneys are trying to prove, but
It
sometimes an
can,
actual physical
yes,
replica of it, if that's the correct word, is
yeah,
better. Okay.
yeah. Yeah, and that's where I can say to the attorney, well, you may want an animation, but you know, you really should have an exhibit. You may want a scale model or a full size if it's not too big. Um, I would, you know, be more than happy to do either one, but sometimes one works better than the other.
And I
And
guess,
I've been doing this long enough to know that I don't feel bad about telling an attorney, you know, you may want to consider something else. You may want to do that. Um, they're worried, they've got enough on their plates and they don't want to have to worry about, how do I work this? How do I, you know, how do I do this? Um, that's the last thing they want. They don't want to look like they're stupid in front of the jury. Like, I don't know how to turn this machine on, or I don't know how to do that. So, you know, we tend to try to help that along.
I think the phrase is mechanically inept is what they don't want to look like, because after
Yes,
all, they went to law school. They did not take shop in high school.
true, true, true.
Okay.
But what I will say, the last over 40 years has been rather amusing at times. To see, and not just my clients, but other accidents and things that have gone on the other side. I've witnessed a lot of trials, and some of them are interesting.
Well, again, not to kiss and tell here, and again, I understand attorney-client issues. Is there an amusing anecdote that you would like to talk about, or should we just use our imagination?
I think we're better to use our imagination, because if I say something, somebody is going to maybe say, that was so and so, and no, we're not going to do
Okay.
that.
All right. So we're talking to Bob Kaplan uh, with the company 11th Hour Animation, which is his company. And we're talking about what he does as a paid hobby and
Yes.
that he's been doing for decades at this point. And how fascinating. Again, who would have ever thunk that there was somebody that did this sort of thing for a living, and even
You're
as a
lucky.
lawyer. I'm still in Flipboard, that time zone. So I didn't know that this was happening. But if you can, I mean, there may be some particular cases that were interesting in a different way that are not embarrassing to counsel. You did mention when we talked something that's referred to in history as the big dig in Boston. And I don't recall whether you personally were involved in that matter or not.
I did some animations for a company that was being pulled into the lawsuit, and did a whole series of animations on how certain processes work, just to show the judge.
Okay, so to acquaint people who may not have heard of the big dig in Boston was what?
They were moving the highway underground.
Right. Massive
And massive,
multi-million dollar
multi-year,
projects.
multi-billion dollar process.
Cost overruns, complaints, traffic congestion, horrendous. Right.
Boston, just say Boston.
Boston. Okay. Okay.
Boston. Yeah,
Okay.
and it's a historic city, and you don't want to tear down landmarks and stuff like that. So they moved the sections of the road underground, and they wanted to explain to the judge why certain processes that they were being accused of weren't true. So there must have been 8 to 15 animations on different processes, and showed it to the judge, and they wound up getting a summary judgment, so they were let out of the lawsuit. I had one case I can describe because it's it hit me so personally, and I was so blown away by the experience. A, a guy is using a bulldozer, and the bulldozer's in like a junkyard, and it's surrounded by screening, a mesh to keep stuff out. In the back where his window is, the screen was missing about this big, about 6 inches wide and about 4 inches high. So he could turn around and view it. 100 some yards away, they're dropping a car into a shredder. And it literally, this giant machine, and it crushes up the vehicle into tiny pieces. And there's all kinds of shielding and rubber and stuff there to stop things from flying out. But in this particular case, I look at it as just fate. A piece of the crankcase from the motor, maybe about a 2-pound piece of metal, flung out of the machine, flew 100 yards, hit this guy just driving his bulldozer in the back of the head.
Through the window. Through the
It went
window.
through this
Okay.
little tiny slit. And I thought, if he stopped and had that glass of orange juice that his wife asked him to have,
Right. Right.
if he didn't roll through the stop sign,
If he
the
sneezed,
timing,
if he
if
sneezed,
he
just
sneezed, if he just decided to wear shoes that he had to tie his shoelaces, where it would take just seconds, it just struck me as so horrible that being in the wrong place at the right time, and how something like this big from 100 yards away, that's just fate, and how it could have changed. But anyway, that's the type of things that I've seen over the years.
well, well, we just have a few minutes. Let me just ask you one quick question about that. Why was it important to have a simulation of that as opposed to, because it sounds horrible just in your retelling of it. I can already sort of visualize it. Why was it important to have the picture, the actual imagery that you do?
To show the jury what a 1 in a billion chance this would happen. It's never happened before. There were guards, there were rubber stuff to stop things from flying out. It was basically like just random chance that something like that happened. And, I mean, it's a terrible accident. And could you blame the manufacturer of the machine that did this? Is it reasonable and foreseeable? For instance, is it reasonable to say that you can't take a screwdriver and use it like a Q-tip? Okay? That's reasonable. Is it foreseeable that somebody is going to take a screwdriver and put it in their ear and use it? Yeah, it is. It is foreseeable. Okay? Is it reasonable to think that a meteorite is going to hit an airplane and knock it down? Well,
Yeah, we already have that. Don't Look Up is the movie that was out. It was a comet.
exactly. But is the meteor going to hit an airplane? Yes. So therefore, should you build airplanes to be meteor proof? Okay.
Right.
No, you can't. And these are legal questions that are constantly happening in the United States
So
and
not to,
elsewhere.
right. So not, again, just for illustration purposes, that simulation that you did helped to illustrate the freak nature
Yes.
of the incident, which then presumably a lawyer representing the company that was doing the scrap metal types work would be able to say, there's no way that, yes, if anything can happen, this happened, but there's no way that we could have done anything different except
Right.
not have that activity going on when anybody's within 100 miles.
It was guarded. There were just hundreds of things. It just managed one piece, managed to get through. And to do the damage it did so far away, I mean, that's the one in a billion.
So we just have a couple minutes left. I'm just going to ask you this question. Do you feel, besides the obvious enjoyment you get out of doing something that's so creative and so useful, do you feel that in the course of your career that you have been helpful in getting, here's a word, justice because of the quality of what you do?
Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. The sad part is that there's many states that have put caps on the judgments.
Yes.
Some horrible stuff. Now, it's not just I work for plaintiff and I don't do any defense work or vice versa. I've done plaintiff and defense work my entire career.
30 seconds.
But there has been over the years a steady cutting back on the awards for litigation,
Yes.
and that's not right. It's not right.
Well, I'm going to make that the last word. I want to thank Bob Kaplan from 11th Hour Animation for being on the show today. If you want to find out more about what he does, in case you need him or you're just interested as I was, you can go to his Facebook. You can go to his website, put in the words 11th Hour Animation, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
.com.
Well, .com. Well, thanks again for being on the show. Truly enjoyable.
Thank you
Bob.
for having me.
Certainly.
Take care.
Thanks.